This episode of New Politics was released on the 28th of September, 2024, and produced on the lands of the Wangal and Gadigal people.
Welcome to New Politics. In this episode, interest rates are on hold, but the Australian Greens want the government to take hold of the Reserve Bank. Are we likely to see any changes on negative gearing? Peter Dutton's nuclear fantasy roadshow continues, and the world is paying the price for not holding the Israel government to account. I'm Eddie Djokovic, editor of New Politics.
I'm David Lewis, one of Eddie Djokovic's fake Twitter accounts.
And just our regular message, listen in, share, subscribe and support New Politics at Patreon and Substack, or you can donate at our website at newpolitics.com.au. And of course, all of this is a good way to support independent journalism.
Don't push me, cause I'm close to the edge. I'm trying not to lose my head. It's like a jungle sometimes, it makes me wonder how I keep from going under.
There's been a lot of speculations about interest rates, and once again the Reserve Bank has decided to put interest rates on hold, and it's been like this since November last year. But the main focus of the week has been on the Australian Greens demanding that the government should instruct the Reserve Bank to cut interest rates in exchange for supporting the reforms that the government is proposing to make to the Reserve Bank. Here's the Greens spokesperson, Nick McKim.
Oh, look, Katie thinks that the Greens are out of control. Well, I can tell Labor what's out of control, and that is the housing crisis in Australia. And if she thinks we're damaging, I can also tell Labor what is damaging, and that is the fact that rents have gone up 30% since Labor came into power, and we've had a record series of 13 interest rate rises in a row. Renters and mortgage holders are getting smashed. Housing affordability, on the figures out this morning, has never been worse in Australia, and we are unambiguously using our political power in the Parliament to fight to bring interest rates down so mortgage holders get some much needed relief.
The Greens were getting quite a lot of traction on housing issues and putting a great deal of pressure on the government to do a lot more to address the national housing crisis, and a lot of the issues that they were focusing were quite sensible and forcing the Labor government to do what we'd normally expect a Labor government to do. But they've lost a lot of credibility by making this call, as far as I'm concerned. The Reserve Bank is independent, and you could imagine all sorts of economic problems arising from a government or a Prime Minister or a Treasurer deciding what the interest rate is going to be, especially in the lead up to an election campaign. And it appears that the Greens have gone for overreach. And in politics, overreach is the biggest problem for a political party. They were getting the traction and the credibility on housing and making the government look quite unreasonable, but that's been flipped very quickly. And now it's the Greens who are looking unreasonable on the issue of interest rates.
Before you all start typing, I'm not a member of the Greens, and I'm not a devoted voter of the Greens. I have voted Greens in the past. I may vote Greens in the future again, but I'm not aligned with any political party except the ones that are more broadly on the left of the spectrum, as opposed to the ones that are more broadly on the right of the spectrum. So when I speak about the Greens, I speak as an interested outsider who wants to see them do well, as I want to see everyone in politics do well, even on the right. And as far as I can see, it's not that they are... I don't know that they're trying to be deliberately destructive. They've been pushed into a position where it looks like whatever they do, they can be presented as being obstructive, as being blockers, as being unreasonable. I know too, so hold the typing just for a sec, people like Max Chandler-Mather can irritate people, and that there's history there with the Labor Party, and I don't know how high up the chain that history goes. Sarah Hanson-Young, who is one of the better parliamentary performers, as far as I can tell, irritates people too. I think you don't go into politics and not annoy people. But the Greens have been pushed into a position where they're getting a lot of public support. I think that's fair to say. They're also getting a lot of status quo opposition. The vested interests of Parliament, which is the 2 or 3 major parties, if you count the Nationals, plus the media don't like the Greens. They seem to have a fair bit of support in the public. Now, how much of that support is from people who understand what is possible in politics, and those who see the green solution as this idealistic, this is the only way we can go, is another thing. What we need to consider here is what they're doing working. And it may well be. When we get, though, to things like the independence of the Reserve Bank, the Reserve Bank's problem is, of course, its ideological layout. Lots of corporates on the Reserve Bank and people who don't quite understand how hard it is if you're not in a high-flying corporate job. And let's be fair, a lot of people aren't in high-flying corporate jobs because they've never had the opportunity to be in one. So Michelle Bullock being able to blithely state, oh, some people are just going to have to sell their house, as if that's a decision that you might make, like, oh, this car is no good, doesn't serve my purposes anymore, it's a bit expensive, I'm going to trade it in for a smaller one.
Or I've already got 12 houses, so I'll just offload one of them.
Yeah. I guess we can do without gardeners for 2 days a week. We'll cut it down to 5. We need to restack, or we need to reappoint the board. It's not just the chair, it's the board. The chair only says what the board thinks. I think we need to restructure. And I know that the government is having a different part look at interest rates to the main board and leaving the board for the rest of banking policy. We've reached an impasse, really. And how we get out of that impasse is going to make for some interesting decisions over the next few months or so. The Greens are already claiming major victories, which the Labor Party is denying. The Liberal Party is trying to wrest a victory too. That their credibility is so shot, I'm not sure why they bother, but, you know.
The other point is that interest rates are very, very political in Australia, and it's just another number when the coalition is in government, but it's of the utmost and critical importance when the Labor Party is in government. And this is a case where small margins and changes are magnified by the mainstream media. If interest rates go up when there's a Labor government, well, it's the end of the world and the sky is going to fall in. But when they come down, well, it's no big deal, and even a monkey could have made the interest rates come down. So that's always going to be the problem for the Labor Party, and also this close to an election, that's probably going to be even more pronounced. And that's probably another reason why the government doesn't want any distractions about the Reserve Bank and interest rates. And I've always felt that good government is mainly about ignoring all the noise and doing what's right for the economy and for the community, and the political benefits will fall into place after that, if you're lucky. But essentially, all of this stuff coming from the Australian Greens about Jim Chalmers forcing the Reserve Bank to lower interest rates, that really is a lot of noise and best ignored. And I just think that the Greens have really made a big misstep here. The action that they were making on housing and negative gearing, I think that made a lot of economic and political sense, but the intervention on interest rates, that's economically and politically naive. And I just think that it allows the government to dismiss the Greens and say, oh, well, look what they were planning to do with interest rates control. You just can't trust them on all of these other things either. And the Reserve Bank position on interest rates, whether or not they've been influenced by politics or by the government, I think that they've actually been vindicated. The long-term issue to address is inflation, and that's come down to 2.7%, and it was at 7.8% in August 2022, soon after the coalition left office. And the short-term issue and the political solution would have been to cut interest rates, and that would have resulted in more and more inflation and an even bigger political and economic problem right now. So it seems that the actions of the Reserve Bank, and we've been big critics of the Reserve Bank over the past few years, but I think their actions in this case have been vindicated.
One of the things I think is correct is that it remains independent from the government in the way the ABC should be independent, in the way that the courts should be independent, in the way that the police should be independent, in the way that most government services should be independent. Sure, the policies should be guided by government and even set by government, but I think you're right that that dangerous precedent of the government somehow, and I'm not quite sure how legally he could do it, Jim Chalmers forcing the Reserve Bank to cut interest rates. Now, I think one of Michelle Bullock's arguments is that we have had historically lower interest rates than the rest of the world. So when America and Japan cut theirs this week, it's still a little higher than what Australia is charging, or went from the same to just a little bit below. That's a whole other argument. The other thing too we've got to remember is that we're still suffering the fallout from the disaster that was the Morrison government, where they stacked everything with Liberal donors, with Liberal mates, and people with a specific ideology. And there's a sense in which the Reserve Bank, I think, is trying to set this. So instead of keep it low, keep it low, keep it low, Labor's going to win the election, ramp them up, ramp them up, ramp them up. Again, I think we need to get rid of the current board or let their terms expire and replace them with economists, with social workers, representatives of lower income people, rather than corporates. I think you're right in that the Greens overstepped their mark, and the current policy of the Reserve Bank, I'm not sure it is justified, but there is an argument there saying it can be justified. I think you're right there.
Oh, there's also been questions about why interest rates have fallen in other countries, Canada, US, UK, you mentioned Japan before. Why have they fallen in other countries but not in Australia? And the answer is that in all of those other countries, well, they started raising their interest rates way before Australia started doing it. And that's because we had an incompetent Reserve Bank governor in Philip Lowe. And we can't really say for sure if he was politically compromised as well, but I think we do have to be suspicious if he refrained from putting up interest rates when he should have in the lead up to the 2022 federal election, and then said that interest rates would remain low for another 2 years, only for them to keep going up as soon as he made that statement. So I think that gave us a small taste of what could happen if the government became more directly involved in setting interest rates. You know, we might end up getting low interest rates with inflation levels of 100%, quickly followed by military coups and riots. So fortunately, that's not going to happen. And all of this talk about interest rates and inflation, essentially, when you look at it, these are just numbers, but it's all about what people in the community and in the electorate really think out there. And the Committee for Economic Development in Australia, CEDA, they've published a misery index. And I'd not actually heard of this one before, but it's a combination of inflation, unemployment, and interest rates that put a gauge on economic despair. And they're suggesting that economic hardship is at its greatest level since 2011, 13 years ago. And it's hard to know what to make of this, but that's what this research is suggesting, that people don't have much confidence in the economy at the moment. It is improving on paper at least, but that's quite meaningless if people still feel that economic hardship is going to continue for some time to come.
I note that the Treasurer dropped his happiness measure, which he did in his first budget. And of course, there was a lot more optimism and positivity about things back then. Whether they thought that it just wasn't something that could be properly quantified, or whether the messaging just wasn't getting through, I don't know. But this misery measure is something that I suspect they'll try and ignore. But it's something that is going to be very hard to ignore as their opponents pick up on it and say, look at this. And whose fault is this? There's a sense in which, of course, it doesn't matter whose fault it is. It's who's in the job at the time.
There's speculation that negative gearing could be reformed, and this is something that is long overdue. Negative gearing does apply to any investment, but the focus at the moment is how it relates to the housing market. And there is a belief that the Labor Party lost the 2019 federal election because of their proposals to reform negative gearing and capital gains taxes. And I think this seems to be a story that is having a life of its own, because there is analysis that suggests that in those seats where people benefit the most from negative gearing and capital gains taxes, the Labor vote actually went up. So it seems that people that might be holding 2 or 3 or more properties that are negatively geared are actually in favour of restricting it. And the Labor policy from 2019, I think, was carefully calibrated so it wouldn't create any losers at the time. Now, it might create losers in the future, but just not at that time for people who did have negative gearing and property investments. And I think there were a wide range of other issues that worked against the Labor Party at that election. Rightly or wrongly, it seemed to be a referendum on Bill Shorten more than anything else. And elections are rarely won or lost on just the one issue. And as always, any reforms to negative gearing will have to be navigated politically, and we are yet to see what the government is going to propose, and they may end up proposing nothing at all. And the Prime Minister has already suggested that there are no plans to change negative gearing.
Well, we have no plans to touch or change negative gearing. What we're concerned about is supply of housing, and I'm not convinced it'll make any difference that's positive when it comes to supply. I have said why I have a problem with changing, which is that it's about supply. And the problem is that all of the analysis shows that a change to negative gearing will not assist supply, and my government is focused on more supply of housing.
But they could probably get that policy from 2019, brush it up a little bit and run with it. It's been a long time coming, and this is probably the best time to introduce it.
Yeah, I think they lost the election because Bill Shorten wasn't able to connect to enough people, whereas the more slick con artist Scott Morrison was. And of course, Scott Morrison showed his unfitness for the role well before, if you were looking, but if you weren't looking, very quickly into it. I know they're blaming negative gearing, but the Australian media is very good at convincing people that stuff that has no effect on them has a very big effect on them. The stocks and shares thing, where people ran down to Centrelink to get their stock benefits when, of course, they didn't have any, and then were upset to find out that they didn't have any, is another example of how you can use emotion to manipulate logical and investment decisions. The Property Council have already come out and said, if negative gearing goes, rents will go up and we'll all be ruined, said Hanrahan. But negative gearing clearly didn't keep rents down. If you're on the lowest job seeker payment, you can't afford to rent anywhere in Sydney, a place by yourself. It's only a few outer suburbs in Melbourne, which is absolutely ridiculous. Now, no one's really saying that you should be able to afford to rent luxury harbourside properties, although, side note, why not?
Well, exactly, why not, comrade?
Yeah. But you should be able to afford on a welfare payment a reasonable piece of accommodation that keeps you warm, keeps you sheltered, keeps you safe from outside. But people are convinced that if the system changes, everything will happen. We're in a strange place in Australia at the moment, and I hope we get out of it soon.
And generally, if the idea of any reforms of any type have been raised, and it usually starts with unnamed government members who have been given permission to spread the rumours with the media, and then it's likely that they'll introduce something or at least fly the kite with the electorate to see what the reaction will be. And, and also because it's been canvassed in the media, the Australian Greens are suggesting that it's because of all of their pressure that's resulted in the government at least thinking about these reforms to negative gearing. And whether or not it's because of these pressures, I don't think it really matters. It's an area that just needs to be reformed because it's one of the driving forces of inequity in Australia. And there's a number of issues that they could look at, which is based on what Bill Shorten proposed in 2019. Limit negative gearing to new dwellings only, limit negative gearing to 2 properties. If they want to be generous, it should just be 1, but okay, we'll go for 2. Lower the capital gains tax from 50% back to 25%. And it's estimated that these measures could save the budget around $8 billion per year, as well as reducing inequality in Australia. And I think introducing something like this would just tick so many boxes for the federal government. It's a policy that could dovetail into other existing and proposed housing policies and actually improve those policies, as well as fitting into the political ambitions of the Labor government. So I think sometimes government just needs to throw caution to the wind. They have to be brave and work towards meaningful policies that will make a difference to people's lives. And it's just a question of whether the Prime Minister decides to be brave on this issue or continue to be timid and cautious, which has been the hallmark of his Prime Ministership.
There comes a point where, and again, it's probably not fair, but Labor governments have to be big and reformist and have big visions, and otherwise they die. And if we look at the Rudd government, who started that way, but ends up folding to the mining, and Rudd then loses his job, and we then have the disaster of the Rudd-Gillard-Rudd struggles, which stopped a lot of good governance. I don't know how they think that they're going to get through this. But again, maybe the whole issue was to go into minority government after so that they could lay blame for stuff that doesn't work on a minority government. It's not the way I think I'd do it, but if it was the way I'd do it, I'd have been king of here a long time ago.
This is New Politics with Eddie Djokovic and David Lewis, one of Australia's top 10 podcasts on Australian politics and news commentary. You can also find us at newpolitics.com.au, and you can also support us through Patreon and Substack.
The leader of the opposition, Peter Dutton, is touring his nuclear power stations policy yet again, and it's the same performance as before. There's nothing new. It's the same conservative whinge fest against renewable energy, and of course there are no costings. Here's Peter Dutton speaking in Sydney during the week.
We'll have more information about the cost of nuclear. We'll have it in good time. It will be independently verified, and it will show a cost differential which is significant in favour of nuclear coming into the mix. But I can give you this guarantee. Our nuclear plan will be reliable. It will be based on the best technology, as I say. It will be a fraction of that cost.
And this is purely a repeat and rinse process, and you could probably splice together his previous 10 announcements on nuclear and present that, and there wouldn't be that much difference. And I think this is a classic point of difference type of politics and stakeholder management of key interests in the resources sector. And based on everything that we know right now, nuclear power is never going to happen in Australia. But this is all about keeping Peter Dutton in the headlines, keeping donors happy and maintaining some sort of political relevance. But it's just not based on any form of reality.
I think the only people who are in favour of nuclear are those that were already in favour of it. Certainly from what we can glean from Dutton's plan, or his concept of a plan, is that prices would go up significantly, $600, which for some people is 10% a year. Others, it's 50, 60. Neither is acceptable. Again, I'm not convinced that 1 in 20 million is low enough odds. 3 Mile Island only happened once. Chernobyl only happened once. And both of them were very low odds of happening, but once it happens, it's 100%. Of course, Dutton has no interest in nuclear power. If he did, they'd have done a comprehensive and well thought out policy. Instead, he's just got buzzwords and platitudes and garbage. I don't think I know. He's doing it because he can extend the influence of coal and gas into the future till 2040, when presumably he'll no longer be in politics anyway. And the gas lobby here is insidious. The way that the COVID Commission was filled with gas experts, not medical experts or epidemiologists or other kinds of health professionals, but gas people and the coal people, who are probably a bit less subtle in how they do things. But it's all about that. And I think those that are sceptical of nuclear power understand this. A lot of those that are in favour of nuclear power also understand this and don't want the Dutton plan. I think as the Liberal Party pushes itself further and further to the right, they do less work for more results. And it's certainly not true that you lose elections on detail. You lose elections on detail when people don't want the product you want. And I guess this is another thing he realises, that most Australians don't want nuclear power, that those Australians that do want to change want renewables such as solar and wind.
And the media never ask that question that they ask of the Labor Party, whether they're in government or in opposition. Well, Peter, where's all the money coming from? And if they're not going to ask the question, well, he'll just continue on his merry little adventure where he puts forward his pie-in-the-sky ideas. And, of course, he has to get permission from Gina Rinehart for all of this because she's a big donor to the Liberal Party and other conservative interests in Australia and is a big proponent of a nuclear power industry in Australia. And if Peter Dutton is not prepared to announce his costings, well, we'll announce them for him. To build a nuclear power plant in Australia, well, the first one would cost $17 billion. Subsequent plants would cost around $9 billion. And Peter Dutton is also proposing building 7 of them, including in an area which recently had an earthquake, so I'm not sure how well that's going to go, and replacing existing coal-fired power stations with small modular reactors would cost around $389 billion. And all of this would add $600 to the annual electricity bill that you referred to before, David. And, and the other factor is that consumers and the taxpayer, well, they're the ones who will ultimately pay for all of this. And these costings are not for fully going nuclear. This is just the cost of having nuclear as part of the mix. So this is one reason why Peter Dutton hasn't released the costings and probably never will. And as we keep saying, David, the nuclear industry is just too expensive for Australia, and there are far better alternatives in the renewable energy sector.
Yeah, I think we're heading to the end of the current lot of vested interests. I think the fact that so many of their people were hammered out at the last election, that the Australian public aren't watching as much free-to-air television where this stuff can be shoved down your throat, and they don't know how to deal with streaming television, that we're getting our news from alternate sources than the mainstream press. I don't think it'll be the end of this year, but I think that over the next 5 to 10 years, we won't be hearing from these people anymore. But of course, privilege doesn't go without a fight. There'll be a lot of screaming and crying and yelling and tantrums and desperation as they slowly fade.
And we've mainly focused on Peter Dutton today with his nuclear proposals and his process of dismissing renewable energy, and all of which keeps coal mining well into the 2040s and beyond. But it's also a question of how serious about the environment anyone in politics is, because during the week, the Environment Minister, Tanya Plibersek, approved the expansion of 3 coal mines, and the message that's being put out from the government is that these are not new coal mines, these are just an expansion of existing coal mines. But logic suggests that an expansion of an existing coal mine means that that coal mine is going to get bigger and there's more coal that's going to be extracted from the ground. And all of this is adding to global emissions. Here's what the Rising Tide activist group had to say about this.
We've just stopped a coal train. There's 9 of us here. We're climbed up on top. We've dropped a big banner off the side and we've started shoveling off a bit of coal. We're here today sending a message to the Albanese government because we're extremely outraged by the approval of 3 new thermal coal mines. They're all upstream of the Newcastle coal port, so they would come out through the port. We're talking about 3 massive mine expansions, 1.5 billion tonnes of CO2 emissions over the lifetime of those mines, going out to 2066. It's absolutely outrageous and we're not going to stand for it.
And it has been suggested that with the coalition, well, they're hostile about the environment and renewable energy, and they've absolutely got no qualms about their ambitions for mining or dirty resource extracting. Nuclear energy, they've got no qualms about pushing that, but at least you know where you stand with them. They're not hiding anything, but the Labor Party just lies to your face about it. They've said that they would look at ways of reducing coal mining when they were in opposition, and now that they're in government, well, they do quite the opposite. They've also got a nature positive summit coming up in October, and I guess it's a little bit difficult trying to get people along to a summit if they called it nature negative, which is what is really going on with the environment at the moment. And I realise that the Labor Party and the government has got a difficult agenda that it's trying to achieve, trying to protect jobs in the fossil fuel sectors, including coal mining in the Hunter region, and working towards reducing greenhouse emissions and net zero by 2050. And we don't work in the resources sector, David. We're in the extremely lucrative podcasting and independent media sector, so we don't know what it's like to face an uncertain future on that sort of level, if that's an area that you've worked in for all of your life. But still, there needs to be a transition out of these areas, and expanding coal mines is probably not the best way of doing this.
Good business knows when it's time to sell up and move to something else. That's been the whole of the Warren Buffett strategy. Buy when something's new, sell it when it's established, watch it when it goes. I know that they think that this could go on, but when you look at the summer Europe had, and it's going to be worse here because Australia has more extreme summers than most of Europe anyway. So when you see Britain with heat waves of 31, and there are people over here laughing, 31, that's not that hot. It's not when you're in Australia, but when you're in Britain where the buildings and the infrastructure is designed for 21, it's a massive problem. It would be the equivalent of 9 or 10 days at 45 degrees here. Things have to change. And smart business and agile business would realise this and react and invest accordingly. And of course some are. Like, I don't want to say every single business person in Australia is completely dumb. Not every single one is. It's going to get to the point where there's just not going to be enough government subsidies to prop these businesses up because the world has moved on and most of Australia wants to move on to new and better, and maybe not necessarily new, but certainly better. They tried the clean coal lie, which was just that, a lie. There's no such thing as clean coal. They tried the fans kill birds, as if birds didn't have a survival instinct and knew to keep away from them. I'm sure the odd bird has been hit by them, but it's not the slaughter that they will tell you. They've tried they look ugly, but then you see what a coal mine does. Again, they're desperate, they're scared. Andrew Forrest is an honourable exception. It's not often you'd use those words in terms of Andrew Forrest, but he has basically said he's transitioning to renewable energy. There are others who are smaller and not as well known, but most of the bigger players aren't prepared to sell up and reinvest. Partly too, I think that if they sell up, they realise they're going to lose a lot on their investment, but also partly it takes courage and it takes will and it takes drive to change, and I don't think they've got much of that left.
There's more political analysts and pollsters who are coming out to suggest that the next election will result in a minority government. But there's a lot of people in the mainstream media who claim that this would be the worst thing ever. Here's Danica DiGiorgio and James McPherson at Sky News.
Voter intention results reveal a strong possibility of a minority government.
Yeah.
Now, you and I have spoken to this at length. A minority government is a disaster. You will have the Prime Minister, followed by the de facto Prime Minister, Adam Bandt, couple of Teals, perhaps a couple of Muslim votes, independents thrown in there. It would be an absolute omni-shambles. Now,
You're right, we may well see a contest as we get closer to the election, but God help us if we get a minority government with an effective Deputy Prime Minister, Adam Bandt.
And what they failed to point out is that the Liberal National Party was in a minority position in government in the lead up to the 2019 federal election for almost a year, and they didn't seem to think that that was too much of a disaster at the time. And although the Senate can't actually create legislation, the Senate is usually in a position where the government of the day never has a majority, so it has to negotiate with other parties. So that's a form of minority process already in government, and the dynamics of politics will certainly be different within a minority government, but there's been many parliaments around Australia in the states and territories where minority governments have been very effective. There's actually a minority government in New South Wales and the state hasn't fallen apart, well, not yet anyway. So the mainstream media like to push through this idea that a minority government would be a complete disaster, but the evidence suggests that it's not, and that it does actually lead to better governance.
I think a minority government might stop the seemingly endless approval of new coal mines that the Environment Minister has announced another 3 this week. You have to be careful of minority governments. minority governments can lead to, in Australia, people like One Nation holding the balance of power. In fact, New South Wales upper house is a mess and was held in thrall by people like Fred Nile for many years, people like Mark Latham, people like David Leyonhjelm. Latham found the rort to extend his term by 8 years. And of course, Fred Nile had his devoted supporters who kept voting him in on 2% of the vote or whatever it is, because you can manipulate the New South Wales upper house voting like that. A lot don't last more than one term because they're pretty useless. But you have to be careful when hoping for a minority government that you get reasonable people. Tony Windsor, a lot of the current Teals would be okay. Ted Mack. Brian Harradine was a disaster for the country, pushing his very narrow religious views into legislation where they had no right being. Having said that, a good minority government, I think, is much better. And of course, the press don't like it because they've then got to canvass a whole range of views and do a bit more work to work out what's going on. And they don't get the ins that the parties give the press, trying to track down an independent who may not wish to speak to you, or a minor party member who may not wish to speak to you, is a bit harder than tracking down a major party who wants to speak to you and who needs to speak to you because they feel that they need to get into the papers. I think we have to be careful what we wish for, but if we wish specifically enough and vote accordingly, it could be a very good thing.
Oh, that's an interesting point, because generally in Australia the political system does depend on people of goodwill, and we don't always get that, and many people would probably suggest that we never get anyone of goodwill in politics at all. But I do genuinely believe that the political system is generally made up of good people, but it's the party system itself that's inherently bad. And you could argue, well, what comes first, the bad party system or the bad people that created that system in the first place? And usually the MPs who end up being a part of a minority government process will want it to work because essentially they've got no other choice. And I think that we can say that for all minority parliaments in Australia, historically, it's been quite effective, except for maybe the ones in Tasmania. That always seems to bring out the worst in people down there. And Australia is not like Italy, where there's been around 70 different coalitions and different governments since 1945. The political culture is quite different in Australia, and it's probably hard to know because it depends on the personalities of the crossbench. And you pointed out some of these issues before, David, and all of these ideas that we've had about minority governments being good for the country might be challenged if it ends up being a Dutton-led Liberal National Party with Libertarians, IPA independents, Katter and One Nation holding the balance of power. But that's not the thing that the media is really worried about. They'd be very happy with this type of minority government. What they're really fearful of is a minority government made up of the Labor Party, Greens, Teals and other like-minded independents. And I don't think we've got anything to fear from that.
This is New Politics, available through Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Audible and YouTube, and also available to support at Patreon, Substack, and at our website, newpolitics.com.au.
Israel has expanded its current war against Palestine into Lebanon, and it's the same story as before. There have been bombs dropped by the Israel Defense Forces in southern Lebanon all the way up to Beirut. 560 people were killed by the IDF and 10,000 people have already been displaced. And this follows on from the pager explosions that more than likely were detonated by Mossad that killed around 200 people and seriously injured around 3,000 people in Lebanon. And I think that this is an extension of what's been going on in Gaza. You know, people are told to evacuate zones in Lebanon that end up being attacked by Israel. A large number of women and children have also been attacked and killed. And this attack and the pager bomb attacks break all international laws and conventions. These are all preemptive strikes that have got nothing to do with the events in Israel in October last year, which were used as an excuse by the IDF to massacre over 40,000 people in Gaza. And the campaign is now continuing over the border into Lebanon, and the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, is now threatening to extend this war into Jordan, even though Israel and Jordan already have a peace treaty in place. And there's many people in Australia that are still saying, well, what can Australia do about this? And they're also suggesting that Senator Penny Wong and the government are being targeted unfairly over their lack of action. And we've said many times before that there is actually a lot that the Australian government can do diplomatically and practically. It can recall its ambassador in Israel, expel the Israel ambassador in Canberra, impose high-level trade sanctions against Israel, stop military permits and exports to Israel, reduce cultural links, sporting links, and pressure other countries to do the same. And all of this is exactly what Australia did with South Africa in the 1970s and the 1980s. And no one at that time asked, well, what difference will this make? It was an important thing to do in international politics, and Australia played a very, very strong part in all of this. And if Australia does see itself as a friend of Israel, well, this is what a friend would do. Tell them that they're out of line, that they're out of control. And I think that Israel will destroy itself if it continues down this path. And someone just has to do the intervention with the Israeli government. And if every country just said, well, what difference are our actions going to make, so let's not do anything at all, well, nothing ends up being achieved and nothing ends up changing. And if this pressure that we're suggesting had started once it became obvious that the state of Israel was committing war crimes and genocide in Gaza, well, we wouldn't be seeing an extension of Israel's actions in Lebanon or trying to extend the war with one of its neighbours that supposedly it has a peace treaty with. And that's why these actions matter, and Australia should have acted a long, long time ago.
Nobody in the mainstream media seemed to complain when Scott Morrison stupidly moved the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem because it suited his own narrow pre-millenarian view of the world and apocalyptic view of the world. That showed us what that particular Australian felt about the Middle East and was effective in so far as it showed exactly what his beliefs were. Why we can't recall the ambassador, why we can't stop selling arms through AUKUS to Israel, why we can't say to the Lebanese people in Australia, we stand in solidarity with you. Lebanon has had a massive influence on modern Australia with a large number of many refugees coming out here and becoming successful and brilliant members of the community, as has many other countries. But why the party of multiculturalism won't stand up and say Australia is a land of peace, Australia values its Lebanese-born citizens, it values its Israeli-born citizens, it values its wherever Chinese-born and Italian-born citizens, and our priority should be helping our cousins, really, in Lebanon not be bombed. We should be making sure that at the very least Australian citizens now stuck there can get home safely. And Israel was condemned by the United Nations, and yet the United States, Australia, the UK and a couple of other countries are still trying to prop it up. The game is over. We're flogging the dead skeleton of a horse that died a long time ago and hoping that we can still get somewhere with it. It's past time to actually stand up for the innocent who are being slaughtered. We can still condemn the actions of genuine criminal groups from both sides, but we know that it's the innocent who are suffering and we should be looking after them. And it's past time we do that.
We are deeply concerned, we're alarmed by the escalation and the loss of civilian life, both in Lebanon and also the attacks into Israel. We have consistently said we wish to see de-escalation. We believe a wider regional conflict is not in the interest of any of the peoples of the region.
And once again, the Foreign Minister sends out the message of deep concern, and I think it usually fluctuates between deeply concerned and gravely concerned. And The foreign minister talks about these incidents but fails to mention Israel at all, and in the case of southern Lebanon showed a deep regret about the civilian deaths in Israel and Lebanon, even though no civilian deaths have occurred in this incident in Israel at all. And you just wonder how long this both-sidism can continue for. And even with Zomi Frankham, the Australian aid worker who was killed in a missile attack in Gaza, Penny Wong could not refer to Israel at all. And it's not like these missiles just fell from the sky from some sort of invisible force. This was an attack by the Israel Defence Forces. Everyone knows this. Israel admitted it. The IDF admitted it. But the foreign minister just couldn't bring herself to mention the I word, Israel. And despite what many people think, military generals do not want war. They usually do their best to avoid it. It's the politicians who always wage wars, and a lot of military experts are suggesting that this war doesn't make any sense at all now. It might make sense for Israel, but not for the well-being and the stability of the entire Middle East region. And it's pretty much for the benefit of Benjamin Netanyahu's political survival, not for the state of Israel. So why should there be so much support for what is essentially one man's political survival? And I think it's also a question of how this will play out politically in Australia. The local Lebanese community is more dispersed throughout Sydney, and there's also strong political differences between the religious groupings and the different village politics from different regions of Lebanon. But despite all of that, I think it will play out in the Western Sydney regions, but I'm just not sure how much. And I really don't think anyone knows the answer to this. But on these occasions, the values of what Australia believes in should be pushed by the federal government, and that just hasn't happened here. The Australian government seems very happy to prop up a right-wing maniac as the Israel Prime Minister and just does whatever an unrepresentative cabal from the Israel lobby in Sydney and Melbourne tell them to do. And this is not what an Australian government is meant to support or represent. That's it for this episode of New Politics. Thanks for listening in. And if you'd like to support our style of journalism and commentary, please make a donation at our website at newpolitics.com.au. We don't beg, plead, beseech or gaslight you about journalism coming to an end. We just keep it very simple. If you like what we do, please send some support our way. It keeps our commitment to independent journalism ticking along. I'm Eddie Djokovic. Thanks for listening in, and it's goodbye to our listeners.
I'm David Lewis. We'll see you next time.
I should.